pleasant day to all, and welcome to our 5th episode of Facts Talk podcast. This project is made possible through the collaboration between Facts Asia and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines. I am Diane Querer. I'm a TV host and news anchor based in the Philippines. Here in Facts Talk, we will examine Europe's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And today, we will focus on the 5th priority area for cooperation, and that is digital connectivity. In the past few years, European states have been actively engaging in the Indo-Pacific. Last year, Facts Asia and CAS Philippines launched a compilation of special articles that tell us how European states have significant interest in the region, including their policy recommendations for cooperation between the Philippines, ASEAN, and the European Union. We're already halfway in discussing the priority areas of the EU. In episode 3, if you could recall, we delved into digital partnership agreements between ASEAN and the EU. In episode 4, we discussed EU's crucial role in helping the region enforce the law and monitor the ocean and the seas. Now, in our 5th episode, we will talk about the developments in digital connectivity concerning Indo-Pacific states and EU foreign policy. Well, nowadays, connectivity is a vital part of our daily lives. We felt its importance during the COVID-19 pandemic as we struggled to reach out to our friends, family, businesses, and colleagues. Connectivity is even more important today as we strive to get our economies back on track. The EU aims to work with partners to strengthen connections between Europe and the Indo-Pacific and help partner countries address the digital divide and further integrate into the global digital ecosystem. Support partners to establish a good regulatory environment and facilitate funding to improve connectivity on the ground between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Joining us today to talk about this highly relevant topic is our special guest expert, Ms. Elina Noor, Senior Fellow at the Asia Program Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Hello and welcome to Facts Talk Podcast, Ms. Elina.
Hi, Diane. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for your time. Now, before we do discuss the 5th priority area of cooperation, we want to know more about you. Briefly, kindly tell us what you do and your expertise about our subject matter for today.
So as you introduced me, I work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I focus on Southeast Asia-related issues, primarily in the security and technology field. So, where security meets technology and governance and laws. So I focus on how governance frameworks are being developed in Southeast Asia, how they impact Southeast Asians, both at the policy level and on the ground, and what that means for the autonomy of Southeast Asian states, but also the people at international forums when talking about tech policy.
All right, now, Ms. Elina, focusing this time on digital connectivity, how will you define this and why is this important for the EU?
Well, there are a number of ways to define connectivity in general, but when we're talking about digital connectivity, we have to think about kind of the hardware, right? The infrastructure that goes towards establishing that connectivity. We're thinking submarine cables, we're thinking land cables, we're also thinking even satellites that enable that connectivity to take place. But we're also thinking about what some people call soft connectivity, right? And so people-to-people connections, the education, some of the policy and legal frameworks that go into regulating that connectivity, as well as educating people on digital literacy skills. And it's important for the whole world, really, including the EU and its ASEAN partners, because as you pointed out in your introductory remarks, it literally connects us, especially in times of need. And it facilitates exchanges and different points of views that I think are very, very much needed in these times.
Truly, it is very vital nowadays. Now, we want to know your views on these questions, Ms. Elina. What can the Indo-Pacific, especially the ASEAN region, learn from the EU's experience and approaches? And why is the EU interested to share its experience through the EU strategy for cooperation?
I think that learning goes both ways, right? And a lot of exchanges have been done between the EU and Southeast Asia with ASEAN member states. The GDPR, for example, is a prime illustration of how many countries in Southeast Asia have modeled their own legislation at the domestic level on a region-wide piece of regulation. The GDPR is now global. It's been incorporated into the domestic laws of countries around the world. And we've learned in this region in Southeast Asia about some of the things that have worked and some of the things that don't work. So for example, even if you talk to EU privacy specialists, they'll say that notions like privacy, like consent, translate very differently on the ground, particularly in a region like Southeast Asia, which is so diverse with so many different languages and dialects. When you think about it, I could ask you, Diane, how does privacy translate into Filipino or any of the languages spoken in the Philippines? And the nuances will be very different, right? Depending on the region, depending on the cultural context. And so in that sense, what you have that works in the EU may not necessarily work to a T as in the EU in Southeast Asia. And likewise, I think the EU countries could learn from some of our experiences trying to translate on different levels, on literal as well as cultural levels, how some of these concepts that we take for granted at the international level translates into and what it means for people on the ground where they're thinking about issues like consent and how their data is being used. So exchanges work both ways, and I think we have a lot to learn from each other.
You made a very good point that it may be different in the EU, may be different in the Philippines, may be different in different countries in ASEAN, the way we interpret privacy, consent, and other topics concerning digital connectivity. Ms. Elina, European states also often highlight the importance of a sustainable, inclusive, and rules-based approach as their priority. How can the implementation of the Global Gateway Initiative contribute to enhancing connectivity on the ground?
I think this is needed. We often think of kind of the infrastructure of tech and some of the softer issues that I mentioned, the communication skills, the educational skills, but we don't often think about the environmental costs and impact of what it takes to build that connectivity infrastructure. And ideas like the Global Gateway, I think, will be key to penetrating some of these questions that need to be fleshed out even more. For example, when building submarine cables, what are the quote unquote externalities, right? Conventional economic theory considers them externalities, basically the environmental impact of laying down these submarines, what it takes in terms of natural resources to make those submarine cables. There's been research done about how some of plant species, tree species have been wiped out in this part of the world in the early parts of enabling that connectivity by building submarine cables. And these are forgotten in our part of the world. And I think we need to relive some of those moments in order to capture some of these environmental impacts. So going to the point about sustainability, but also downstream, what it takes to sustain that whole data lifecycle. What happens with the computing power? What happens with the location of data centers in areas with the clearing of local communities, with the clearing of biodiversity? These are some of the points that we in Southeast Asia will have to work out with our European partners in trying to enable a meaningful cooperation.
Now, this time, Ms. Elina, what do you think are the distinctive features for cooperation and or hard connectivity and soft connectivity potentials that may contribute to better cooperation between European states and the Indo-Pacific region?
I think some of this understanding that we just talked about that I mentioned would go a long way towards contributing to greater cooperation. So the more we understand how some of these concepts that emerge from the EU, but then are widespread and used very, very prolifically around the world, actually translates on the ground, is something that could make for better understanding between the two regions. Likewise, I think we could do a lot in understanding how some of the policy guidelines that are being developed in other parts of the world, apart from Europe and Southeast Asia, and I'm thinking here of Africa, of Latin America, how some of the concepts that surround digital connectivity in its different forms could work well in our context. These are some of the lessons that we could take together in making for better understanding on some of these issues that continue to plague us when it comes to digital connectivity. We're still trying to figure out, for example, how to regulate data, how to regulate privacy, how to regulate AI, for example. And as we just talked about, there are different ways in which some of these different regions accept and interpret, as well as apply these very different concepts to their different regions and cultures. And so I think a greater understanding of how the world works and how differently or similarly it works could go a long way towards enhancing cooperation between our regions.
You mentioned about artificial intelligence is also a very relevant topic nowadays. How can we take advantage of AI in terms of, having greater cooperation between the Indo-Pacific region and the European Union?
We're still trying to figure it out. Europe is grappling with this, as are Southeast Asian states. I think with the upcoming AI Acts, of course, Europe is going to be a leader once again in regulating some of these tech developments. Southeast Asia will probably follow suit because we're so plugged into the world through trade. But as I mentioned, I think it's really important to take a look at some of the fascinating conversations going on around how civilizational culture, for example, and history can play a role in interpreting what we often see as the present and the future when it comes to tech. We don't think about history. We don't think about, cultures when it comes to technology, but they're really very dependent on how tech is applied and used in various cultures. And so when it comes to AI, we still have a lot to learn. The EU might do it one way, Southeast Asia might follow bits of it, but there's still a whole world to explore, and different scholars in various parts of the world are trying to understand it based on their local context, but also trying to incorporate some of the international developments that are happening around that space.
Ms. Elina, what are the challenges in the strategy for cooperation in digital connectivity?
Oh, so many threats and risks that we continue to read about every day. I think, especially with big data analytics, with AI and algorithms, there's a huge concern surrounding bias and discrimination about what happens with the design of algorithms, how they play out in our very diverse cultures and settings, whether there's any transparency around the creation of these algorithms and training of these algorithms, where are these data sets coming from. Unfortunately, we in Southeast Asia tend to market ourselves as users and customers. We have this large base of users, but we very rarely think of ourselves as standard setters and rule makers. And I think we need to have more of that mindset, particularly when collaborating with our European colleagues. I know there are European counterparts that are very keen to try to raise the visibility and ideas of people in Southeast Asia at international forums, and we should definitely be looking into ways to make that happen with the EU.
Ms. Elina, let me shift the topic this time a bit more towards geopolitics. What is the EU's role in the increasing competition among great powers in the cyberspace? What does it mean for ASEAN states?
I think the EU can play a moderating role in tempering some of these Sino-American tensions that we see. There's a real concern about the fragmentation of cyberspace, not just in terms of the infrastructure, but also in terms of some of the rules and norms that are being developed around cyber governance. And the EU has emerged as a leader in data and privacy, but we haven't seen yet very much of its role in trying to really create a third way with the norms and rule setting in cyberspace. We see bits of that happening, and you see some cooperation with ASEAN states, very few ASEAN states, unfortunately. I think there's more of a role that both the EU and ASEAN states can play in trying to ensure that this fragmentation is a long way off and it's distant, and that we can all continue to enjoy a stable and secure cyber space that will benefit us in different ways.
On that note, I would like to thank you, Ms. Elina Noor. Thank you very much for the information you've shared to all of us with regard to to digital connectivity. And of course, we'd like to thank you all who joined us today. Well, in summary, Ms. Noor emphasized the importance of both hard and soft connectivity between the EU and the region, as well as how vital it is for us to learn from the EU. She also mentioned how learning goes both ways, that the EU also has much to learn from the region. With regard to great powers, we also learned that the region can also benefit from the EU if it steps up in its role as a mediator and if it helps smaller and less powerful states in the realm of cyberspace. If you loved and learned from this podcast, please share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Also, if you missed our previous episodes, you may also listen to them here on Spotify. We invite you as well to like and follow Facts Asia official social media accounts, facebook.com/FactsAsia on Facebook and at FactsAsia.org on Twitter. You may also visit our website, www.factsasia.org, to stay updated on our projects. That's all for now. Again, this is your host, Diane Carrera. Until the next episode of Facts Talk Podcast.